All right. Well, welcome. Thanks to everybody for joining us. My name is Bernard Prusak, and I'm the director of the McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at King's College, which is in northeastern Pennsylvania. This is our 2021 Science and Humanities lecture, focused, as the name suggests, on the intersection of the two. This is also the sixth of 9 second semester events serving the King's academic community, our alums and friends, our regional community, and increasingly people from all over the country and all over the world even. I saw among the registrants a number of people in the UK. Brian has told me that you're 4 hours ahead of us, so 11 p.m. That's quite remarkable that you're joining us. Thanks for being here. Thanks also to our presenters, Brian Volck and Joel Shuman. Brian Volck is a physician, writer, and poet. His practice and research interests include global child health, Native American child health, medical education, cross-cultural medicine, medical ethics, and the intersection of poverty, justice, and health. His books include a volume of poetry, Flesh Becomes Word, and a work of theology, Reclaiming the Body, Christians and the Faithful Use of Modern Medicine. Current projects include a memoir on medicine and writing, and a study of the intersection of health, history, and culture in the Navajo Nation. And Brian, thank you for joining us. He'll be, as you all know, our main presenter this evening. Our respondent will be Joel Shuman. Joel is professor of theology at King's College. In a prior life, before his graduate studies in theology, he practiced physical therapy for 10 years in Wisconsin, Virginia, and his native West Virginia. Joel's writing focuses on the intersections of theology and the applied biological sciences, especially medicine, and he is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 4 books and many articles and book chapters. He's currently working on a book on the opioid crisis, which, as he rightly wrote to me, is the other epidemic of our age. Last but not least, I want to say about Joel, he's a treasured colleague here at King's. So let me just do some quick nuts and bolts, and then we'll get right to it. This event is being recorded, and I'll post the recording maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow morning on the McGowan Center's YouTube channel and then Facebook page. I'll also send a link to all people who registered for this meeting. And again, I'll probably do that tomorrow, though maybe tonight. If you happen to be able to unmute yourself, which shouldn't be the case, I'm sorry, please don't unmute yourself. If you happen to be able to turn on your camera, please don't do that either. So we'll do Q&A through the chat. Probably all of you have been on Zoom, maybe all too often. The chat box is down toward the bottom of the screen. You can only chat with me, Brian, and Joel. For the Q&A, please send questions to me, and I'll do my best to introduce your questions into the mix. I probably should apologize in advance. I see we've got 90 plus participants. We'll probably be over 100 in a little bit. I might not be able to get your question asked, but I'll do my best to make sure that that happens. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much again for joining us, and thanks to Brian and thanks to Joel. And take it away, Brian.
Thank you, Bernard. And thank you for inviting me to speak. Let me do the share screen feature and we'll get started. Okay, let me start from the top and we'll get going here. That's not what I wanted. Let me go do that again. There we go. All right. And thank you again for inviting me. My talk is entitled Plagues, Pandemic, and Lessons from Literature, with a long quote that we'll get to from Daniel Defoe. Over the course of the past year, the United States assumed undisputed world leadership in an unflattering category. Though the US comprises 5% of the world's population, it accounted for a quarter of global documented COVID-19 cases and a fifth of COVID-related deaths. There is little doubt the raw numbers grossly underestimate the actual COVID disease burden in this country. The COVID-19 pandemic remains deadly serious business, disrupting lives, the economy, and all that the word economy once encompassed, our households, common lives, and communal practices, before that word was appropriated by the so-called dismal science. People you know and love have lost their lives or their jobs, taken ill, been exposed and quarantined, or found themselves isolated, estranged, abandoned. There is much here to mourn and far more to learn from in order to prepare and respond more effectively when the next pandemic comes along. And come it will. Pandemics like earthquakes and hurricanes are what statisticians call stochastic events, by which they mean phenomena that occur in a random probability distribution or pattern that can be analyzed statistically, though the precise timing of any single event cannot be predicted. As such, they mock the peculiarly modern delusion that humans can manage the planet's affairs according to our desires, as if our technology-enhanced powers and Earth's material gifts had no limits. 4 centuries after Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes proposed that knowledge is power, we are shocked to discover that humanity's power is making the world harder, not easier, to live in. Having barely acknowledged, much less responded to, the logical consequences of our collective irresponsibility, including global climate change, unprecedented soil loss, oceanic dead zones, and accelerating species extinction, we're once again assaulted with pandemic pestilence. Technology, transport, and global distribution systems did not cause the SARS-CoV-2 virus to mutate in such consequential ways, but they sped its worldwide dissemination. Fortunately for us, this new virus is neither so transmissible as measles, nor so lethal as Ebola, and in contrast to HIV or malaria, a highly effective vaccine proved rapidly forthcoming. The next pandemic may be less forgiving. We will be forced to reckon with the limits and the costs of our vaunted powers in a post-COVID-19 world. Judging from our collective failure to reimagine how we might live and what we will of necessity have to live without in a rapidly changing global climate, long-term optimism seems out of the question. As Wendell Berry observed in 2006, quote, "The normalization of the doctrine of limitlessness has produced a sort of moral minimalism, the desire to be efficient at any cost, to be unencumbered by complexity, the minimization of neighborliness, respect, reverence, responsibility, accountability, and self-subordination. This is the culture of which our present leaders and heroes are the spoiled children." This is not a partisan issue. The rancor in our current national politics is just another symptom of our larger failure to reckon with limits and complexity. Nor is this something easily remedied by sweeping legislation or individual effort. Furthermore, I am not a policy wonk here to propose a 5-point plan for making America safe again, as if that were possible. I don't know how or if we will learn to live more responsibly. But I do know that any realistic effort toward that end must grapple with the dysfunctional habits humans often revert to when confronted with large-scale adversity. Though we might find answers in social psychology or related disciplines, we have to get the questions right. And I doubt we can properly name our most pressing problems, much less address them, without consulting elements of our literary and religious tradition. This evening, I'll consider a tiny sliver of that tradition. What a few selected works of Western literature have to say about how humans over time have responded to these threats peculiar to plagues and pandemics. In Daniel Defoe's novel, The Journal of the Plague Year, the narrator marvels at how the nearness of death has broken down some of the religious divisions in plague-stricken 17th century London. He wonders if another year of shared wrestling with that most intractable of human limits, bodily death, might lead to further ecumenical healing. And he says, quote, "Here we observe, and I hope it would not be amiss to take notice of it, that a near view of death would soon reconcile men of good principles one to another, and that it is chiefly owing to our easy situation in life and our putting these things far from us that our breaches are fomented, ill blood continued, prejudices, breach of charity and of Christian union so much kept and so far carried on among us as it is. Another plague year would reconcile all these differences. A close conversing with death or the diseases that threaten death would scum off the gall from our tempers, remove the animosities among us, and bring us to see with differing eyes than those which we looked on things with before. 3.5 centuries later, our own situation in life, at least in the so-called developed world, is far more comfortable than that of Defoe's narrator, while the reality of human vulnerability and death are held still further from our consciousness. Perhaps we need a bigger jolt than COVID-19 to see anew. Great literature can bring us face to face with unavoidable limits and remind us how humans can behave when forced to confront them. Tonight, I will focus attention on 3 unhelpful responses: practices of scapegoating, social disorientation and disintegration, and the denial of death. It's impossible to read Sophocles' Oedipus the King today without hearing the ghost of Sigmund Freud whispering in one's ear that it's all about forbidden sexual desire. But that's hardly the best nor the only way to read that text. Sophocles opens his rendering of the familiar myth in the middle of a deadly plague against which the best medical care of his day is useless. People of all ages and stations fall victim, young and old, rich and poor, noble and peasant. This social leveling with its attendant fear and overwhelming sense of powerlessness leads to what the late literary critic and philosopher René Girard calls the crisis of distinctions. What was assumed to be the normal order of things, in this case, the health of a well-run city-state in which each person knows his or her station and role, is toppled by the capricious finger of contagion. In Girard's anthropological framework, the community's desperate need to make sense of their descent into chaos spawns the search for a scapegoat, someone to blame and whose death or expulsion reestablishes order in a new unanimity -1. Oedipus anticipates his city's collective mind by calling on Apollo's oracle at Delphi, the ancient Greek version of searching the internet. Sure enough, there's a murderer to blame, and Oedipus, intent on finding him, triggers an unanticipated series of events that ends in personal catastrophe. What Sophocles knows and Freud seems to forget is rather simple. Killing one's father and beheading one's mother is extremely rare, while passing the blame is all but universal. Today, we know that plagues are caused by infectious microorganisms rather than one man's moral transgressions, but the impulse to assign guilt remains. When things don't go as planned, dashed expectations churn fear and resentment into fertile ground for conspiracy theories. Finding persons to blame and punish grows more urgent than getting the facts right. As James Baldwin writes, quote, "These captive men are the hidden price for a hidden lie. The righteous must be able to locate the damned." Just as some 14th century Christians falsely blamed the Black Death on scheming Jews, some 20th century Americans blamed the 1918 flu pandemic on barbaric Germans who allegedly spread the virus in toxic clouds from offshore warships or in tablets of German-made Bayer aspirin. COVID-19 has been falsely attributed to bioweapons labs funded, depending on the particular conspiracy theory, by China, the US government, or a power-mad Anthony Fauci. Asian Americans have been targeted for verbal and physical abuse, attributing to them guilt by association for the so-called Chinese virus. As the rise in targeted acts of violence against Asian Americans, including this week's shooting deaths near Atlanta, suggests, this animus is unlikely to go away anytime soon. I personally witnessed a form of disease scapegoating while working as a pediatrician on the Navajo Nation in the spring of 1993, as the first cases of a novel and highly lethal hantavirus were identified. Though the mouse-borne virus was ultimately linked to deaths throughout the American Southwest going back to 1959, The Navajo Hatashli, or medicine men, could describe existing ceremonies to treat what became known as hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, and had gone on to warn others about the warm, wet winter's bumper crop of mice, the very creatures that carry the virus. The news industry, nevertheless, took to calling the illness the Navajo Flu or the Navajo epidemic. The total number of cases that year was 53, with 32 deaths, including non-native people living hundreds of miles from the reservation. But the Navajo took the brunt of the economic and social fallout, including the inevitable racial stereotyping. Restaurants in Phoenix reportedly turned away Navajo customers. Some who were served had their plates and cutlery thrown in the trash afterward. 2 regional universities required all Native students, Navajo or not, to have special medical screening before arrival on campus. There have since been scattered cases of hantavirus reported each year throughout this country, but the disease lives on in popular memory as Navajo specific. One need not read René Girard to know that scapegoating is alive and well. As we have come to learn over the past 12 months, pandemics disrupt routines we've come to take for granted. They also limit our responses in difficult situations. Canceled vacations and virtual classrooms are trivial examples compared to those who've died in hospital rooms apart from their loved ones, postponed, rushed, or perfunctory funerals, and massive job loss in economic sectors that may never recover. Yet few pandemic-related disruptions in the world rival the Great Mortality or Black Death, which began in 1346, as disease-bearing rodents fled the effects of climate change in Central Asia. By the end of this first great wave of the pandemic in 1353, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people had died worldwide. Intermittent waves of the 14th century pandemic returned to Europe over the next 400 years. This wasn't the world's first encounter with the plague bacillus known today as Yersinia pestis, nor would it be the last. That there are still 7 or so cases of plague diagnosed every year in the United States should remind us that the end of the coronavirus pandemic won't mean the end of coronavirus infection. 3 classic works of fiction bring us directly into the experience of plague and its attendant social disorientation. Giovanni Boccaccio's massive Decameron opens with a description of Florence in the grip of the Black Death, where the pestilence causes some to shelter in place and isolate, while others choose to, quote, drink heavily, enjoy life to the full, go round singing and merrymaking, gratifying all one's cravings whenever the opportunity offered, and shrug the whole thing off as one enormous joke, close quote. Others choose a middle path, living soberly while breaking the rules on select occasions. And then there are those, mostly the rich, who have someplace to go, a vacation home where they can get out of the way when things go bad. Like reality TV programs of today, Boccaccio turns his attention to the young and beautiful in this last category, who leave Florence for a villa where they pass the time sharing stories of love and adventure, the medieval version of binge watching Netflix. The tales are often satirical, frequently bawdy, and generally entertaining. At the end of their 2-week vacation, these rich refugees abruptly return to Florence, the women to their homes and the men to, quote, other diversions. Something of an anticlimax given the city's horrific death toll in their absence. As in our country today, Boccaccio's Florence saw some of its citizens devastated and others merely inconvenienced. Late in Alessandro Manzoni's romantic novel I Promessi Sposi, known in English as The Betrothed, we watch a slow and inadequate government response to the 1630 plague outbreak in Milan made far, far worse by public circulation of conspiracy theories, bad medical advice, and refusals to maintain social distancing. The denials of fact, heated finger pointing, and unsubstantiated claims the Milanese hear and repeat sound like they were ripped out from this past year's news. As in our shared expectations of 2020, pandemics do not occur in isolation, but in conjunction with other social upheavals, which in the novel's case include war, famine, and revelations of widespread corruption. Though the engaged couple for whom the novel is named are finally reunited after an eventful and prolonged forced separation, they find themselves still very much in love, but also profoundly changed. I've already mentioned Daniel Defoe's novel, A Journal of the Plague Year, from which this presentation takes its subtitle. Defoe's journal, so rich with detail and statistics that some read it as a lightly fictionalized history, describes the Great Plague of 1665 through the eyes of an English saddler. Written circa 1721, when European powers were imposing quarantines to confine yet another plague outbreak. The novel closely observes Restoration London's metamorphosis through blind chance and human choice. Astrologers and quacks peddle worthless cures. Family servants and relatives who fall ill are shut in their homes and abandoned. What emerges at the end is a depopulated and rapidly changing city that will be further transformed by the Great Fire of 1666. We might learn from these examples to be cautious about what our, quote, new normal might look like. Popular demands for an immediate return to business as usual are understandable, but premature. The recent and encouraging decline in US case rates has started to plateau just in time for spring break. Lingering disorientation should be expected. That many will forget the lessons COVID could have taught them is all but certain. To be alive is to be vulnerable, and no vulnerability in life is more universal or more certain than death. Among the limits contemporary society most fiercely denies is the fact of our mortality. Those who die in pandemics have plans, hopes, and aspirations. Most people tacitly agree with Viktor Frankl's paraphrase of Friedrich Nietzsche, quote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Let me say that again. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Death, we believe, is what happens to other people until it happens as it must to us. From Nietzsche's day to ours, this denial of death has only grown stronger and more pervasive, a trend our best writers have noted and addressed. Albert Camus' novel, The Plague, chronicles an existentialist's search for meaning in a modern Algerian port city cut off from the rest of the world by an outbreak of the plague bacillus. The novel's protagonist, Dr. Rieu, labors heroically to save lives despite his growing conviction that life is inherently absurd, a meaningless sequence of encounters with suffering that ends in death. He watches others struggling to make sense of things and suspects that those who can do so are deluded or mistaken. When the plague burns out and the quarantine ends, Rieu declines to join the celebrations and the return to normal, finding himself unable to forget the dead. The novel ends with his thoughts, quote, "He knew what those jubilant crowds did not know, but could have learned from books, that the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good, that it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chests, that it bides its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, and bookshelves, and that perhaps the day would come for the bane and the enlightening of men. It would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city." Catherine Ann Porter's novella, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, sensitively captures an American experience of the 1918 influenza pandemic. The so-called Spanish flu, which probably began not in Spain, but in Kansas, infected a third of the world's population, killing more than 50 million people worldwide and 675,000 in the US alone. In Porter's story, a young woman and a US soldier share their short time together in the bliss of new love. Ignoring the twin threats of America's entry into the First World War and the rising wave of influenza, the couple speaks of death as a remote possibility, cloaking their concerns in figurative language and dark humor. The woman falls ill and the story takes a turn I won't give away, but rest assured, things do not end well. Those who survive learn, as many of us have over the past year, that death may be denied and ignored, but it will not be cheated. You can, no doubt, think of other works of literature and other diseases I've overlooked in this brief review. There are dozens of classic novels, stories, and plays about many other conditions, and I'll list some recent novels to consider at the end of my remarks. Furthermore, I've limited my discussion to European and American literature and named only 3 of the many dysfunctional ways humans respond to pandemic crisis. There's 4 more of these to consider, but we'll pass over them today. Yet, bleak as my account may seem, none of what I said tonight is meant to deprive anyone of hope, which stands in contrast to optimism as a lion to a house cat. Authors and poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Seamus Heaney have recognized this difference all along. Optimism is the domesticated and domesticating belief that things always turn out for the best, if not now, then soon. Hope, however, is the conviction that a desired good, while uncertain, is nonetheless attainable. Hope is a virtue inseparable from courage, and like courage, burns brightest when the necessary hard work is shared. What's more, good work done in common is cause for joy. Learning to live within our limits will require many hopeful companions who share Wendell Berry's vision that, quote, the community, in the fullest sense, a place and all of its creatures, is the smallest unit of health, and to speak of the health of an isolated individual is a contradiction in terms. In such localized communities, each member contributes his or her loneliness, memory, and experience to a shared history, the best fruit of which is wisdom. Communities learn how to live within limits only when they discipline the power of knowledge with this hard-earned wisdom, much of which is stored in what we call our cultural heritage, in religious and literary texts we ignore to our peril. It is, for example, a very different thing to imagine a community as consisting of interdependent members gathered into one body, as St. Paul does in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, rather than as a collection of autonomous, rights-bearing individuals who happen to live near one another, as many of us have been taught growing up in the United States. Autonomy and individual rights are, to be sure, goods, but they are limited goods. It's true that communities under stress may become closed, sectarian, and xenophobic. Yet members of a community who are conscious of their limits, mutual vulnerability, and interdependence are often better prepared to resist the gravitational pull of scapegoating, social disintegration, or the denial of death. Paradoxically, it is within a community that actively remembers and learns from its mistakes and failures, as well as its successes, that one may best, quote, see with differing eyes than those with which we looked on things with before. Literary and sacred texts constitute an irreplaceable record of our failures and successes, a record based in history, broad in historical scope, yet breathtakingly intimate. At the very least, they remind us that humanity has weathered the like before and can do so again. So whether one is a medical scientist scrabbling to demystify the latest coronavirus variant, or in a profession that brings you in direct contact with a virus's victim, or waiting, however impatiently, for your turn to be vaccinated, we all would do well to learn how our ancestors lived in a world of chastening limits, world still very much with us. And I'll conclude with just this list of some recent selected novels that have dealt with pandemic illness as well, either existing or projected. And Bernard, I'll get out of the share screen function and I'll just say thank you.
Thanks to you. Joel, I hope you can start your camera and unmute yourself. There you go. Good.
Go. We owe Dr. Volck a debt of gratitude for challenging us to respond to the present moment and its inevitable future analogs in ways that exceed the permutations of hubris, despair, and rancor that typify our public conversation. We're equally indebted to him for directing us to literature, a repository of the kinds of understanding we so desperately need. Given, as he rightly says, that long-term optimism seems out of the question, our prospects for freedom from our dysfunctional ways depend on our discovering or rediscovering different ways of seeing and speaking about and inhabiting the world. I join him in believing that we may indeed learn such ways from the great stories of human adventure and misadventure we call literature. To spell out the gravity of our situation, Brian turns to an essay by our mutual friend, Wendell Berry, who for more than 50 years has been calling out our pretensions to control and our disdain for limits. Like Berry, he sees our literary and religious traditions as affording us opportunities to rediscover certain fundamental truths. Namely, we are embodied mortal creatures inhabiting a finite world about which we have limited understanding and over which we have limited control. Should we go on ignoring or denying these realities, Berry warns later in that same essay, we will cease to exist as humans. Perhaps we will cease to exist, period, end quote. Existing as humans, being fully humanly alive, is a challenge in the best of times. The literary examples Brian mentions, along with our own collective experience of the past year, remind us that adversity wrought by plagues and pandemics can bring out the worst in us. But the subtitle of Brian's essay, taken from Defoe's The Journal of the Plague Year, suggests the possibility of learning from such adversity, allowing its lessons to animate the better angels of our nature. Whether the balance tilts in one direction or the other is in no small measure a function of our moral imagination, for our capacity to act differently depends upon our ability to see differently. The 20th century British novelist Iris Murdoch said, "I can only choose within the world I can see in the moral sense of see," which implies that clear vision is the result of moral imagination and moral effort. Literature can shape our vision in profound ways. In its pages, we encounter exemplars of virtue and vice, and the conflicts between them. In the best literature, those dispositions and conflicts are not simply between or among characters, but also within them. We often recognize ourselves and our difficulties in these conflicts. And so we may find ourselves awakened to and inspired to work toward embodying different and better ways of being in the world. At the end of Dr. Volck's lecture, he quotes the poet Seamus Heaney, who distinguishes between optimism and hope. The question I'd like to pursue with Dr. Volck for the next few minutes has to do with the ways literature can help us negotiate that distinction and assist us in cultivating the virtue of hope, especially in light of his claim that long-term optimism seems out of the question. Perhaps we can begin by attending to the skeptical protagonist of Camus' The Plague, Dr. Rieu, who, despite being unable or unwilling to articulate reasons for doing so, continues to care for the suffering sick as if it's the only thing that matters. In doing this, he embodies what is perhaps that novel's best known passage, spoken by the enigmatic visitor Taru, who says, "All I maintain is that in this world, there are pestilences and there are victims. And it's up to us, so far as it is possible, not to join forces with the pestilences." This may seem simple to the point of childishness. I can't say if it's simple, but I know it's true. Thank you.
Well, Joel, thank you for a invigorating response and a good question at the end. The first thing that comes to mind is another one of our mutual friends, Stanley Hauerwas, who points out that one of the reasons we know that medicine is still a profession is that it can cure, it can care for people that it can't cure. Let me say that again. One of the reasons we know that medicine is a profession is that we can care for patients that we can't cure. Now, this runs into some problems these days because when medicine gets defined as the cure of, or the relief of suffering, then we get into the ethical debate of whether you have a patient who cannot be relieved of his or her suffering, whether you can eliminate the suffering by eliminating the sufferer. But I'm not going to go that direction. So there is an understanding within medicine, at least as I understand it as a profession, that we continue to care for those that we can't necessarily cure, and we try to do our best to make the best out of the situation that's available to us. I've known you long enough to anticipate where you were probably going to go with this, so I thought a little bit about some novels, starting with The Plague, since you mentioned Ryu and Taru. The person who comes to mind in terms of somebody who discovers the difference between optimism and hope is remarkably, and this would seem paradoxical, is the priest Père Pantalou, who delivers two remarkable sermons. The first one, first homily, is early in the plague, and he's giving the standard religious version of the scapegoat myth, which is that we behave very, very badly and God is punishing us. And then over the course of the plague, he starts to see people who could not possibly have misbehaved, including young children who are dying from the plague, and he can't really quite understand it. So he modifies his position and says, at one point in his second sermon, he talks about what he's learned, and he makes this reference to a monastery, I believe it was in Marseille, where the entirety of the monks in the monastery died, save for, I believe, 3, and 2 of those fled to get out of the way of the pestilence, and one of them remained and somehow survived. And Father Pantalou says, "We must be the one who remains. We must be the one who stays." Now, it's interesting that Camus, who's willing to call himself an agnostic, if not an atheist, has Pantalou die later from what may or may not have been the plague, and he's listed as a doubtful case at the end, which suggests that that Camus thinks that perhaps Pantalou has come a little closer to his vision of absurdity. But nevertheless, he says, we must be the ones who stay. We must be the ones who continue to work, even though we can't necessarily make sense of what's going on. 2 other novels come to mind. The second is Middlemarch by George Eliot, which I like to think of as the wisest novel that was ever written. I believe you have some Tolstoy that you could counter that with, but I'm going to stick with George Eliot. And at the very end, there's this reference to the novel's heroine, Dorothea Brooke, who had so much promise and so much intelligence that does not flower in the way that it could have. And here are the closing lines of the novel. But the effect of her being the effect of her being on those around her was incalculably diffusive. For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistorical acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number of who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. And the third one that comes to mind is to get out of the Western literary tradition. I'm going to go to Shusaku Endo, most famous for his book Silence, turned into a movie by Martin Scorsese. But I want to reference his last novel, Deep River, which describes several tourists from Japan who are in India. And at the very end of their stay there, it's during the assassination of Indira Gandhi. Things are quite a mess in the city of Varanasi, and people are in an uproar. And two of the Japanese tourists see one of the nuns who works with Mother Teresa, who's trying to take care of somebody who's a poor person who's been injured in the melee after the assassination of Gandhi. And it says, this is quoting from the novel, one of the Japanese tourists is called Mitsuko. I'm a Japanese, Mitsuko spoke to the Caucasian nun. Can I ask why you're doing this? Taking care of the sick person who's been injured and is obviously poor. What? With a look of surprise, the nun opened her blue eyes wide and stared at Mitsuko. Why are you doing this? Her eyes still brimming with surprise, the nun slowly answered, because except for this, there is nothing in this world we can believe in. Mitsuko had a hard time hearing whether the nun had said except for this or except for him. And the him, I presume, is referring to Christ. So I think in each of these situations, there's a sense that there's hope, but not necessarily optimism. And this sense that even though we're not guaranteed success, we stay in the game, and we stay in the game because other people need us there. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's where I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Thanks to you both. So we have a number of questions. I'll get right to it. Some having to do with that distinction between hope and optimism. Different question, though, to begin with. So, Brian, do the various literary accounts, some that you cited, others that you can tell us more about, trace any patterns in the aftermath of plagues that might be instructive for us? So you focused on what we can learn, about the reaction to the plague. What about the aftermath?
Well, as we hinted at about the Albert Camus' The Plague, there's a sense that we're returning to normal all of a sudden, and everything's going to be back to the way it used to be, and Ryu knows that it's not going to be. I think that the pattern that that one can trace through various literary sources is this sense that when things are over, things are somehow going to be completely over, and we'll get back to normal, and we won't have to think about that anymore. And the wiser storytellers know that that's not true. There's Year of Wonders is a novel that that's set in the Black Death in England. It's about a town that this is based on a true story of a town that isolated itself from the rest of the world so that it wouldn't spread plague to other villages, and other people wouldn't bring it in. And it did so for a year. The story ends in a rather, to me, unsatisfying way. The novelist has ended in an unsatisfying way, but nevertheless, what she documents is this disintegration of society during the course of the epidemic, with people abandoning others and the rich going away, rather as we see in both the Journal of the Plague Year and Decameron. But part of what leads up to this unsatisfying conclusion is that the woman who's telling the story finally decides that things are so different, having been through this, that she has to leave England. She has to go somewhere else. And part of the reason she has to leave England is that because people have decided that things are going to be entirely back to normal, and she knows that they can't be, that something has changed significantly. So I think if there's a pattern in literary treatments of plagues and pandemics, it's that when the plague is over, people imagine that they can return to their lives as they were, and they just can't.
Thank you. A number of other questions. Also, some people have been referring to other works of literature. I'll just mention one. Veronique Tajo, if that's how you say her last name, her novel In the Company of Men, which
Oh, yeah.
2014 Ebola epidemic.
Yes. Yes, I can't speak to, I know of the book. I'm not familiar enough to say anything of note about it, but I know of the book and have heard good things about it.
Might be another one just for people to consult. So here's a question for you. Have we gotten any better? Have we improved? Have we regressed? Have we learned it all from literature and history? What would you say? What's the evidence from our current pandemic?
I would think that history is a remarkable record of how easily we forget things. And I think that in the United States, that may be a more robust habit than in some other places. So it's not clear to me how much we've learned. There is at least one book, I'll not name it. There's at least one nonfiction book that describes the 1918 epidemic of the so-called Spanish flu, which its primary point is that medical science was up to the task, and that one of the reasons medical science was up to the task was that it didn't consult religious or literary texts, but it worked on pure hard science. This was about the time that the turn towards what we would now call evidence-based medicine, in terms of in the United States and elsewhere. And so there was a way in which there was a scientific approach to the virus, but at the time, virus did not mean what we mean today. Virus meant some small thing that they couldn't identify. There were certainly no vaccines available for influenza. For some time, there was a confusion as to whether a bacteria called Haemophilus influenza caused it influenza or not. And it seems to me that saying that somehow science or biomedical science took care of what was going on with the 1918 pandemic seems to miss the point of how many people actually became ill and died. And it certainly dealt with it in ways that aren't comparable today. As I was saying about that, something comes to mind about the previous question, and I want to bring it up because it's dealt specifically with Ebola, but it's dealing with the question of what are patterns we've learned, or what does literature show us in terms of how people deal after epidemics. My wife was working for the CDC, and she did a month of Ebola detail in Sierra Leone. Now, at this time, the Ebola epidemic had largely burnt out in Sierra Leone, at least. So they were dealing with the aftermath. And there was, interestingly enough, a group meeting of survivors of Ebola, which was remarkable in itself because Ebola was previously thought to be largely non-survivable. So that the fact that you could get 200 people in one building who had survived Ebola was nonetheless was remarkable. One of the occurrences, however, was that since Ebola survivors had this ambivalent reputation. One is that they had this disease, and so there was something a little bit problematic with them, that they had been somehow tainted by this virus, virus, and there was some public fear about them. On the other hand, because they had survived, they were eligible for some governmental benefits, including cash. And when my wife was at this meeting of Ebola survivors, there was suddenly a scuffle, and the US and European doctors were quickly ushered out. And the reason there was a scuffle is that there were people who were trying to get in who claimed that they had survived Ebola, but in fact had not, or at least were accused by others of having not, because they wanted to claim the benefits. So even in the aftermath of something as devastating as the Ebola epidemic, there are people who still respond in pretty unfortunate ways, and I suspect that will happen with this pandemic and whatever comes next.
Joel, if you want to add at any point, please do feel free. All right, so Brian, I think some of our audience want to be not only hopeful, but maybe a little more optimistic too. At least we have some questions pushing in that direction. So you reviewed 3 unhelpful responses, or as you put it, dysfunctional responses to pandemic: scapegoating, social disorientation and disintegration, and denial of death. Have there been any helpful responses, or functional responses, I suppose we might say?
Well, in the novel I referenced before, Year of Wonders, the decision by the village to cut itself off and retain the plague in itself, take care of its own and not spread it to other people, that was a helpful response. I think that we see in the plague people who try to escape Oran, the city that's under quarantine, but most stay. Again, there's a sense that if you're sick and potentially contagious, you need to stay where you are. Trying to think of other. Well, certainly there are always heroic people who continue to serve. This reminds me of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' comment that whenever you see a crisis going on, you look for the helpers. And I think that there are those who rise to the occasion. Is it Rodney Stark? The one who wrote the Rise of Christianity. He points out that one of the things that marked Christians apart from pagans in the late antiquity was that when epidemics came through, doctors, including the famous Galen, would go for the hills, would leave town, and it was the Christians who stayed behind and nursed the sick, who saved lives, because just basic nursing, keeping people clean, giving them clean water, giving them food, increased the survival rate. And those people remembered who had taken care of them. And Stark believes that this was probably more conducive to conversions to Christianity among the populace than their preaching or the degree of their faith. It was that they practiced this and did this in public to people who they weren't related to.
There's a question about opportunity in this crisis. I'm not sure if I can formulate it well, but so what are the opportunities that this crisis presents to us? So if we're hopeful about goods, what are the goods toward which we might work in this moment?
Well, I think one of the things that's fairly obvious to those who have been paying attention is that the U.S. medical system has a lot of creaky seams in it, and it doesn't take care of all the people that it should. People like to say that the United States is the best medical care in the world based on public health criteria such as child survival and expected expected age and expected life expectancy rather. That a lot of these measures suggest that we aren't the leader in the world for medical care. We certainly are the most expensive medical system in the world, taking up a huge amount of the US economy. So I think one of the things that would be helpful in the United States in particular, is to look at what disparities the pandemic is revealed in terms of race and ethnic based disparities, and how these might be addressed in the future. I think also, and I'm not sure. Let me put it this way: I'm a hopeful pessimist, which is probably why I phrased things as I did. I truly believe that we can do better. I'm not necessarily sure that the U.S. Will find the moral resources to deal with such things as how do we convey to one another the need for public health measures that might inconvenience us for the benefit of others. I hope we can do that. I hope so. I'm not sure we necessarily can, as one might witness in the number of people who strongly resisted wearing masks when told or recommended to do so. So I would put those as the first two lessons that come to mind. I don't know if Joel has any suggestions.
I think you just touched on something that's really important, that goes to a distinction between hope and optimism, that a lot of the times optimism comes packaged as being assured about the capabilities of our knowing and our controlling. The notion that we have a lot of smart people on this and we'll figure something out. And so much of that is a way of saying that we'll figure out a way to get through or past this problem without having to change ourselves or our lives.
Right.
Which is in the Wendell Berry essay, Faustian Economics, that you quoted in your lecture.
Yeah.
Something that he says is that he uses one of my favorite phrases of his, the homeopathy of more technology.
Yes.
The notion that we can address our problems without having to change ourselves, without having to live differently.
And I would probably add Wendell Berry's essay, The Way of Ignorance, which describes different sorts of ignorance. But there's a ignorance of humility that says, as Wes Jackson would put it, we don't know billions of times more than we actually do know. So why don't we play to our strong suit and realize that we're ignorant about a lot of things and that we need to be very careful about what we do. So there's a responsible form of ignorance that says, I just don't know how we're going to do this, and I shouldn't count on the fact that we're going to invent our way out of this mess that we're creating, including global climate change and whatever the next pandemic will be.
I have two questions about literature, and then I think we'll close with the third question. So one question is relatively straightforward. So it's a teaching question. Brian, do you use literature to teach medical ethics? And if so, could you give us some examples?
Well, I used to, I founded a program when I was back in Cincinnati called Literature in Medicine, where we used novels and short stories and sometimes plays to talk about medicine and the moral dimensions of that. Again, as I said, I know Joe pretty well because sometimes we collaborate at St. Mary's Seminary and University here in Baltimore, where we co-teach a course in theology and medicine. And Joel has always been interested in using literary pieces in his work, and I've just sort of fed his I don't know whether you call it passion or addiction to that. We've used things such as Hawthorne's The Birthmark, which is a story about a scientist who wants to remove the one imperfection he perceives in his wife's appearance, and it comes at a high cost. We've read The Death of Ivan Illich. We've used scenes from Shakespeare to talk about grief. Yes, there are many ways in which one can talk about medical ethics using literature. We used to close the literature and medicine course I did with the medical students with the book I mentioned, Shizuko Endo's Deep River. We tried one time to close with the plague, but it's so dreary at the end in the plague that there's much more hope in the Endo book. Those are the ones that come to mind. I could tell you more, but those are the ones that come to mind immediately.
The Wendell short story Fidelity we've used.
Fidelity, oh yes, yes.
A very good story.
All right, one more question about literature or popular culture, maybe. So this is really asking you for your take on contemporary popular culture. Do you think that it serves hope, or do many works that are popular instead work against hope? Are they instead nihilistic, dark, violent, individualistic, and so on? So another way to put the question, so does our culture sustain hope? Does the literature that we produce sustain hope, or does it work against the resources that we need?
It depends on what literature you're talking about. I think that there's a deep tradition in Western culture, as there is in other cultures as well, that does sustain hope rather than optimism. And we could talk about works from Asian or African literature as well, but I'm more familiar with Western literature. I think that what passes for the popular today tends to emphasize American individualism and American exceptionalism in ways that that I think are unhelpful, because as I said towards the end of my presentation, I think what this requires is a community, and a community that recognizes that it's interdependent, not only in the humans in that community, but on all the creatures who are there. So it depends on what you're looking for. I think that there is enough unrest these days that that could be used in very good ways in terms of getting past this sense of American individualism and American exceptionalism. I'll wait and see whether that bears fruit or not. Joel, do you have any thoughts to contribute to that as well?
No, I don't. I just find myself more and more disconnected from my undergraduates' popular cultural touchstones, and I just can't keep up anymore. I try, but and I think one of the things that is characteristic of a lot of popular culture is it is so transient today, and that
Yes.
the students are flitting about from one thing to another, and so they don't have any sense of permanence in terms of what their touchstones are. I asked them to name a book or an artist who's influenced them significantly, and sometimes they have a hard time doing that.
Yeah. I mean, Sigmund Bauman talks about an era of liquidity, that everything has become liquid and disconnected. And I think that for those who haven't had the ontological mooring that comes from engaging a cultural heritage, that it's very hard to resist that liquidity.
All right, I have a final question for our hopeful pessimist. We might have two hopeful pessimists here. I'm not sure. You can choose your label, Joe. So some people have written me that they're quite taken, Brian, with your allying hope and courage.
Yes.
Your observation that hope turns on courage, involves courage. So what keeps you hopeful? What are goods that you courageously hold on to in this moment?
That people have been kind to me, sometimes when I didn't deserve it. That I have seen people who have acted heroically and are exemplars. That there are people that have made public statements that they're going to stick to doing something, and they continue to do it. I mean, one of the things that's remarkable about marriage is that two people get up in front of other people and say, we're going to stick together for the rest of our lives. And part of the reason that those other people are there is to make sure that those two people stick to their promises. I think that hope and courage are virtues, and all virtues. If you're significantly deficient in one virtue, you're going to be deficient in other virtues as well. Aristotle used to talk about the three kinds of friendship. There's the friendship of people who like each other's company. There's the friendship where they're striving towards the same telos, and there's or end, and then there's the friendship where people try to encourage themselves to be their best, to reach their full potentiality. And I think that those friendships that exhibit all of those require kindness and courage and hope. And these are the things that keep me going. I see that among the Navajo that I'm finally going to be able to get back to next month after a year when I couldn't go. I see that there in terms of their hospitality and care for others. I see that in my city, despite all of Baltimore's bad reputation. There's some remarkable things, and those are the little flowers in the otherwise neglected garden that keep me going.
Joel, do you want to speak to that?
Friendship is always the first thing that comes to mind for me, that both in terms of the ways that I continue to marvel at the loyalty of my friends, and also the ways that certain friendships in my life have been a crucible for making me better than I would otherwise have been. My relationships with colleagues and students never cease to surprise me. And that gives me hope.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody who joined us, and thanks to our excellent presenters. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you.
I'll put this recording up as soon as possible. While I still have some people with us, don't go everybody quite yet. While I still have some people with us, next Thursday, same time, 7 p.m., the 2021 Grimes lecture is to take place. That's entitled "The Gravity of Trifles, Confucian Manners and Morality." It's with Amy Olberding, who's presidential professor of philosophy at the University of Oklahoma. Her respondent will be Catherine Filbert from King's College, assistant professor of philosophy. So that'll be really good too. And I encourage people to join us again. Thanks to you both. Thanks to everybody, and have a good night.
Good night.
Right.